of these wonderful speakers that we have today. And we're really very lucky to have such a great committee and such wonderful speakers. Finally, I also wanted to thank again Sergeant Robin Scales, who did so much of the work for this, Nanette Marakovitz at the Jackson Foundation, who again worked very hard on it, and Eddie Whitehurst, so that they've all been great help. Now, this particular session is on who should we study? A reevaluation of justice and autonomy. And the important Belmont report summarized the work of the National Committee and discussed both of these comments, both of these concepts, autonomy and justice. But yet, since that time, first, the environment for human subjects research has changed, and because these concepts are still as important as they ever were, but in fact can be looked at and reevaluated in light of what has happened since that time. In addition, the science of drug studies has progressed to the point where we begin to see that, in fact, the 70-kilogram white male is not necessarily the only subject or the most typical subject to be used in trials, and that is really one of the things that we're going to be looking at today, and that is the use of other subjects in trials, the concepts behind that, and some of the things we must think about as IRBs and as investigators. Our speakers today are both superbly qualified to speak on this topic, as can be seen from the biographical sketches in the symposium syllabus. Our first speaker today is Karen Rothenberg, JD, MPA. And she's a professor of law at the University of Maryland at Baltimore campus. She's also director of the Law, Health, and Care program, and she was a member of the IOM Committee on the Ethical and Legal Issues Relating to the Inclusion of Women in Clinical Trials, which is, in fact, a 2-volume work, which I think has had a good effect on the field and has, in fact, changed policy, I think, or is bringing about changes in policy since that time. And she will begin today by discussing some of the principles for inclusion of other subjects such as women in trials and some on vulnerable subjects. Karen. Oops.
Good morning. Just in terms of full disclosure, before I get started, being as ethical a person as I can be, first of all, I should also tell you that from 1995 through 1996, I was asked to serve in the Office of Research on Women's Health on NIH, working through the implementation of the new guidelines in this area. So I have now gone back to what do you call it when you're not in the military? Civilian service, right? Free, somebody said. I'm now free. Now free to say irresponsible as well as responsible things. I have a little bit of time and perspective on it now that I'm back in the, quote, real world of academics. But that I also have to admit, in terms of full disclosure, that I have never been in a room with the military. And that this has been quite an interesting experience for me, learning a little bit about, in preparation for today, about research in the military context. But in terms of full disclosure, that is not my expertise. So I come to that part at the very end of my discussion. I was asked to give a little bit of a comment on what specific things, perhaps in the military context, which you all know better than I do, raise some really unique and interesting ethical questions. Okay, without further ado. Throughout the discussion of these 2 days, but certainly within this section, I want us to try to put the justice perspective in context and share with me 4 assumptions that get made about the principle of justice. One is that to do good research, we need to have a fair research agenda in order to be able to get information that can be of value to the entire population. 2, that we recognize historically that we have gaps in knowledge gaps in knowledge about certain diseases, gaps in knowledge about differences among subpopulations that may have relevance in the future of being able to treat and give the best care in the future. Third, and I don't know how relevant this is to the military context, but it was raised in the first session because in many, as you know, I guess about 40 million people in this country still don't have access to treatment. That isn't the case in the military. You do have access to treatment. But in those areas where there is no access at all, what implications does it have to have a just research agenda in an unjust healthcare structure? And how do those play out in terms of vulnerability and voluntariness in the context of just research? And then more, and I don't think it's so yes or no, because even though in the military context there is access to treatment, there are also differences in terms of your chances to get into promising research protocols. So that access to promising what we would call applied research or quote experimental treatment, which might be an oxymoron, that in fact is still seems to be an issue in the context of the military. And then fourth, what we've heard already is the shifting paradigm between recognizing not only the burdens of research, but also the benefits of research. And if we recognize that there are both benefits and burdens, how do we justly share those among various members of our population? Now, the other main perspective that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this session is this concept of informed consent. Informed consent, which helps us to actualize our principle of autonomy. Again, what, if any, special areas we want to focus in on the end, and I think Bill Freeman will do more of this in the military context that may raise special challenges. Now, within the informed consent issue then, let's take into consideration some subparts of this that may be relevant to us. One is the actual process, not the form. Two, the role of assent and permission in the context of experiments on children, human research on children. Three, the context of family, not only recruiting, for example, active military, but their dependents. What role the children have in making decisions. What role people that are in the extended sense of family have. How do people actually make autonomous decisions? This isn't unique in this situation to only research, but it's something we need to focus more attention on because we have some assumptions in these regulations about how to promote autonomy. And then competency, voluntariness, and vulnerability that all go to how to try to make sure that the person that's saying yes to the research really means yes. And what, if any, particular protections we want to have in place for the, quote, vulnerable, and how, in fact, do we make sure that we have in place things that protect them but not deny them any chance of being future beneficiaries to research. Now, this is just a very quick sketch of some of the major milestones for considering the inclusion of women in clinical research, beginning probably in about 1985 with the Public Health Service Task Report that clearly showed what tremendous gaps in knowledge there were by the exclusion of women in most clinical research, and then ending in that's not so well focused here. Whoops. Ending, because that's about when I ended at NIH, with a very important workshop looking at how IRBs were doing on inclusion. Those materials are in your materials, the summary of the workshop. But let me just focus your attention, one, to June 1990 with the GAO report that explained how poorly the research community was doing in including women and women in clinical research. And then in June 1993, with the passage of the NIH Revitalization Act, in which there is a companion DoD Act that requires the inclusion of women in clinical research. Now, this is the policy, that the inclusion of adequate numbers of women from various racial and ethnic groups in clinical studies is essential to elucidating differences in disease susceptibility, progression, and treatment among various groups. Now, this is not affirmative action. This is good science, that in order to be able to do good science and in order to be able to improve treatment and strategies, you need to be able to get data not only on white men. Now, this seems so obvious to all of us right now, I hope. The challenge is how to put it into practice when you're reviewing protocols. In 1993, following the passage of the law, and the National Institutes of Health promulgated a series of regulations and guidelines that, in fact, put into place the Act's intent. And the guidelines require, one, that women and minorities and their subpopulations be included in all human subject research, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. For phase 3 clinical trials, include them such that valid analysis of differences can be accomplished. Perhaps most significantly, and which varied from earlier policy, cost is not a reason for excluding these groups, a highly controversial provision in the context of NIH research, and then doing outreach. There were exclusions. It was not an absolute requirement. If it's inappropriate with respect to the health of the subjects, is inappropriate with respect to the purpose of the research, i.e. you're doing a prostate study, or is inappropriate for any other reason that the director of NIH may designate. Now that sounds like a significant loophole, but in practice it has not been, based on the research that we were able to do as of last year. This is a typical tracking report that would be used at NIH. And you can see along this matrix, you've got male, female, unknown, meaning they just didn't give enough data. I think that's probably very, very low at this point. And then across the top, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, not of Hispanic origin, Hispanic, white, not of Hispanic origin, other or unknown. Now, what you can't tell, and what I think is a real problem, is you don't know the age of these females. So are they women of childbearing potential, or are they all postmenopausal women? And how does it break down by study? We don't have that data, to the best of my knowledge, at NIH. They didn't have it by the time I left. And this has been, though, generally very helpful to see how it's broken down by subgroup populations. And the last data that I looked at, although this may have since been updated, was that it pretty well matched what it was like in the general population, with slight, and that went for the male and female, and it also went for the ethnic origin. There was some variation, depends on the types of studies, but generally speaking, it was a pretty good match. Now, as I said, the Department of Defense has a very parallel requirement that women of the armed forces are included as subjects in each project of clinical research. There is a waiver authority similar to those 3 exclusions I just shared with you for NIH, similar exclusions, and that the project provides for valid analysis of whether variables will affect women differently. So you can't just say, oh, it's the same for men and women. There has to be a valid analysis of the variables. Now, mentioned by Dr. Bolger, in 1992, the Institute of Medicine was commissioned by the Office of Research on Women's Health to study in more detail the particular challenges of including women of childbearing potential and pregnant women who have just uniformly been excluded from clinical research, and dealing with those ethical and legal challenges. First of all, as I said in that very first perspective slide, their assumption was made that the justice principle would guide our deliberations, and that a national research agenda should promote the health and well-being not only of men, but of women and men, and that research would yield scientifically generalizable results applicable to both genders. And this was our guiding principle when we made determinations about inclusion. The potential or prospect of becoming pregnant during a study may not be used as a justification for precluding or limiting participation in women of childbearing potential. Basically, just because you're a woman of childbearing potential does not mean that you're always pregnant. Now, the rationale for that presumption was a review of ethical and legal principles, including constitutional, common law, and ethical principles that you all are familiar with. The status of liability concerns. Now, this was a real challenge because we had heard a lot of concern about the liability of including women and pregnant women in clinical research. But the issue was, what about the liability of exclusion? What about giving treatments to women, giving drugs to women, giving drugs to pregnant women that had never been researched, but that in fact were out there in the market? What about trying certain clinical procedures or techniques on women that had never been tried? Angioplasty, for example, originally. We've now seen real differences in men and women. So all sorts of drugs that we're now beginning to see differences in men and women. So the experts on the panel made the ultimate judgment that there might be liability for inclusion and there might be liability for exclusion, and your guess was as good as ours, and that in research, as opposed to clinical care, there really was not much liability exposure. The cases that were out there, and there were cases, were in clinical practice. They were not in research, and that was a very important conclusion that we made. That the evaluation of both men and women of risk to reproductive system be done in the same manner as risk to other organ systems, and that the informed consent process was critical in the individual being able to evaluate risk to reproduction and potential offspring. Now, in some ways then, what this has done, based on the title of our session, is it's merged justice and autonomy as underlying principles in order to promote better science. And how do you do this? One, you discuss the risk to reproduction and potential offspring in the informed consent process. You discuss contraceptive options in the informed consent process. You discuss pregnancy termination options in those studies in which you do not know what the risks are. And if lactating, you discuss any specific risks to children. But lactating women were not to be routinely excluded. Now, this was our real challenge. And today, in all IRBs, this continues to be a real challenge or not a real challenge because we just routinely continue to exclude pregnant women. Well, the Institute of Medicine's determination was that that was not just because we had significant gaps in knowledge. And any of you out there that treat pregnant women know the daily frustration of not being able to answer any of these questions. We have medical management of pre-existing medical conditions. People don't just all of a sudden show up pregnant, perfectly healthy. They may already have diabetes. They may already have cancer. They may already have lupus or high blood pressure. How do we know how to treat them? Or asthma when they're pregnant. There are then those medical conditions of pregnancy and conditions that threaten a successful course of pregnancy. Two other areas that we don't have good research on. Now, this is what we decided. First of all, we shifted the presumption. And this has not yet happened in most IRBs. The presumption with pregnant women shifted from exclusion to inclusion. Let's first just presume they're like everybody else. And that then, once we set that presumption, it's the responsibility of the investigator and the IRBs to ensure that we've got some information being provided to them about the risks and benefits as autonomous individuals making a decision. Give them the information. This does not mean that we have to actively go out and recruit them for each study. You don't require to have a certain percentage of pregnant women in each of your studies, but you don't ban them the opportunity, and that you recognize that in some studies it's justified to exclude them. You're not going to put them in a contraceptive study. I mean, that one's pretty obvious, right? So it's not 100% inclusion, but it's not 100% exclusion either. Now, when may we exclude them then? There is no prospect of medical benefit to the pregnant woman, and the risk of significant harm to the potential offspring is known or can be plausibly inferred. So the bottom line is, you don't go on automatic, let me just go back for a second. You don't go on automatic pilot and just say, or not even ask, why is this group being excluded in this study? What's the rationale? Does it make sense? And if it does make sense, justify it. That's a shift and the change of behavior that is not very easy, as we see, for many people to make. In fact, Subpart B of the regulations currently set a presumption that pregnant women are vulnerable, that pregnant women should generally be excluded unless there's some strong medical benefit to them. And what we propose is that Subpart B be changed to reflect this presumption of inclusion, to not call pregnant women vulnerable, because that presumes that they're not capable or they have some sort of diminished capacity to be able to make decisions that are best for them and their potential offspring. And then finally, to eliminate the paternal consent requirement that requires at this point, absent an exception, for the potential partner to also consent to the clinical trial. Now, what then does this mean for the IRBs in order to be able to promote this change in policy? First of all, it requires that you ask the investigators to provide gender, racial, and ethnic composition for the study, that you determine that the composition is equitable, that you engage in educational efforts regarding biases, and that you collect data on study population composition and research topics of all studies. Okay, let's get a hand up here. How many of the IRBs are doing that? All those things. Okay, the rest of you are honest. All right? Because you shouldn't feel bad, because this is like a wish list. Okay, well, we're going to come in the answers period. We're going to see how does he go about doing it, because this, in fact, the first part about determining that the composition provides all this. If you're in an NIH study, you now have to do that, a lot of that, and provide that information. But the real challenges of what I was saying earlier about avoiding a sort of a automatic pilot and really looking at each study and saying, do these criteria make sense? That's got to make for better science. It's certainly going to make for a more interesting IRB meeting. Now, in February of 1996, the Office of Research on Women's Health held a workshop to just sort of see, you know, we're in this about 2 years now. We're now in it about 3 years now. Let's see how we're doing. And what clearly came out was that they were doing pretty well at understanding what they were supposed to do, but they continued to have some practical and ethical challenges about women of childbearing potential, more so pregnant women, and also low-income minorities, where there was a real concern, ironically, that now that we were sort of promoting, in terms of justice, including women and minorities, were we going so far as to make them a commodity that we needed them and that we really had to be worried about, were we going too far in the other direction in there being some sort of coercion, because they were such hot commodities, particularly in areas where there weren't that many subpopulations. There were concerns about involving the community. If you've got no offense, but if you've got a community, an IRB, and everybody in there pretty much looks the same and acts the same and talks the same, it's not as easy to think about ways to really bring the community in to do a better job, not so much of recruiting people in the trials, but retaining them in the trials. Because you could have a really great protocol and a really great recruitment strategy, but you can't meet your goals. And so I'm going to ask you, when your IRB is doing such a good job, how do you do the continuing reviews to see that, in fact, yeah, they said they were going to get 50%, but they only got 5%. Then what? And then the consistent standards for collaboration, that if you're going to do these studies with varieties of subpopulations, how do you in fact make sure that everybody is consistent in their standards about being fair and right in terms of ethical recruitment? Oops. Okay, now what I want to do is to shift gears and talk just very briefly, leave you sort of a thought or two to think about in terms of the military context and whether or not that raises for you some unique challenges. And this might be obvious to all of you because this is what your job is. This is what you think about day to day, and whether or not the recruitment of women minorities sort of teaches us anything more or raises any additional challenges in the context of the military. I was asked by Dr. Bolger to answer this question: are active duty military a vulnerable population? I don't know. Are they? I think I would say let's avoid automatic pilot, just like I told you to avoid automatic pilot with pregnant women. First of all, let's ask what the context of the research is. Where are they doing the research? In what context are they doing the research? Are they healthy volunteers or are they sick patients? If they're sick patients in a military hospital, I'm not so sure why it makes a difference whether they're in the military or not. I mean, their concerns we have about their voluntariness may be the same concerns we have about any person who's sick and wants hope. Is there something unique, as the radiation study raised, about a volunteer ethic in the military? I mean, I noticed just being here today that everybody volunteers to open the door for me. Well, you know, are people just more willing to say yes, because they're more concerned about pleasing? I don't know. I mean, I think we could raise those same questions in other contexts as well. The employer-employer relationship, although, again, you could have medical students here and you could have medical students at the University of Maryland that may be recruited. Or you could have people working in each of those places. Is there something special or different about the military? And then the command situation, which I think the military is beginning to raise, that may raise some interesting concerns about the process of getting informed consent or having certain categories be excluded. Now, in the radiation report, then they raised these three challenges. Well, they raised the first challenge and the third challenge, and I stuck the second one in there. The first is, how do you discern the demarcation between research and military duty, training, and medical care? Now, if we took the military duty and training part out, probably the number one question that those of us concerned about research ethics raise is, how do you know when something is research, and how do you know when something is medical care? I see David Korn sitting in the second row now. I mean, we just talked about this a few days ago. And certainly if you think about oncology, for example, I mean, some oncologists admit to me, you know, well, it's all really research. You know, there are some things that either extremes, but everything sort of in the middle is pretty gray, you know, and sometimes we call it therapeutic research. And sometimes we call it a treatment trial, and sometimes we mish our words together. Well, in addition to that, then, does the military also raise these questions about the context of what military duty and training are? And I don't know whether that may have some relevance to that question or earlier about some of those studies that are done, you know, the macho studies that were raised about doing them with pilots. Then the second one is including women of childbearing potential. Now, I think by my calculation, probably the majority of women in the military are of childbearing potential. So that's a big group you wouldn't want to exclude. On the other hand, you don't have 50% of people in the military that are women yet, or anything near to that. But you've got a lot of dependents, and you've got a lot of other people surrounding you that are women. But I would be interested, in fact, in finding out how in the military context you do your job in making sure you're doing a study that has some generalizability to the women and the women in the military and the women not in the military that may have some relevance. And then the last, which is ensuring voluntariness of participation, which brings me to something proactively that you've already done. To the best of my understanding, looking at these DoD directives, you now have a policy or directive in place that says officers and senior NCOs in the chain of command cannot be present during recruitment briefings of personnel under their command, and that an ombudsman must be present at group recruitment briefings. Well, these are process solutions that let's do something to limit the process so that we can at least try to address, and I think in a creative way, an attempt to really try to get at this concern about is this voluntary? Are they in fact vulnerable? Without throwing the whole baby out with the bathwater. So I think what I will do is I'll stop at this point, and Dr. Freeman will come up, and then we'll open it up for suggestions and questions and dialogue. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. William L. Friedman, MD, MPH, and he's Director of Research and Chair of the IRB in the Indian Health Service. And in addition, just recently, he's spending part of his time detailed to the National Bioethics Advisory Committee here in Washington. And he's looking at some of the special issues related to inclusion of minorities in clinical trials. And as you came in the door, I think that you were given a copy of his slides. And as you leave, he has another summary paper that you'll be given.
Thank you, Ruth. I want to thank the organizers of this fine symposium, and it is one. I'm impressed with the faculty and glad to be able to be here to listen. For inviting a colleague from a sister agency, the Indian Health Service, to speak about minorities in research. In the handout for this talk that you received at the beginning, you notice that I have two addresses, the second being the National Bioethics Advisory Commission. When I was initially invited, I was 100% in the Indian Health Service, but now I'm detailed half-time from IHS to what we call NBAT. As you know, research is under an initiative to recruit minority people in research conducted or funded by the federal government. The initiative concerns specifically phase 3 trials, especially randomized controlled clinical trials, or RCTs. Karen Rothenberg has already discussed certain specifics of the initiative, so I will not discuss it in detail. That's unusual for me. Usually I'm heard well. Rather, I want to discuss some historical background and ethical issues about that initiative. As I hope you will see, these issues are also related to another concern of the ethics of research in the military, namely consent in the command situation that Karen just raised. An assumption underlying the initiative was that research was beneficial for the participants. That research was good for participants has been expressed most strongly since the HIV/AIDS epidemic, in which AZT treatment and PCP prophylaxis were shown to be life-prolonging, and then several more drugs since then. If research is beneficial to participants, then society should ensure that minority people have access to it. As Dr. Wickham pointed out, a prior view, and a view that undergirded many regulations to protect human subjects, however, was that research was sometimes dangerous to participants. A well-known, or the well-known archetypical experiment in the public mind was the intentional exposure of military volunteers and researchers to yellow fever-carrying mosquitoes. Could I have the first overhead, please? Oh, is that the first? No, just leave it there. Scandalous experiments before the 1970s were also well known and had shocked the nation. Those experiments had two qualities. They lacked consent and were likewise dangerous to participants. Such research included institutionalized mentally retarded children who were fed material from human feces with what we now know as hepatitis A virus in the Willowbrook experiment, Jewish nursing home residents, most of whom either had dementia or did not speak English, who were injected with human cancer cells, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and primarily Hispanic women in San Antonio who were randomly given placebos versus birth control pills without their knowledge, that is to say the placebos, to determine the side effects of birth control pills. Not surprisingly, a side effect of the placebo pills was unintended pregnancy. These well-known scandals before the mid-1970s involved vulnerable people. A less well-known example was the RCT in the mid-1960s of children with impetigo, in which one of the arms was placebo long after penicillin treatment was known to be effective. This research occurred during an epidemic of a strain of streptococcus in the impetigo that itself caused acute glomerulonephritis in the children. The children were seen in an urban public clinic. Guess, 90% of them were African American children. Our first bioethics commission, the National Commission, that met 1974 to 1978, developed the current regulations to protect people participating in research. Experiments such as the impetigo RCT led the Commission to note the overuse in research of minority people from public clinics and hospitals. The National Commission thus invoked justice as one of the three ethical principles that research should observe. Could I have the next slide, please, or overhead? This overview of recent history of research in the U.S. raises two questions. One, is research a benefit or a danger to participants? Two, does the initiative to include minorities and women in research contradict the principle of justice? Could I have the next overhead? The answer to the benefit versus danger question is that research continues to have as outcomes to participants benefit, no benefit, or harm. Furthermore, we cannot predict ahead of time which of those three outcomes will be the result of a given research study. This overhead is restricted to recent phase 3 RCTs in AIDS or cardiovascular disease, with one exception which will be clear. Researchers wish all trials of experimental treatments are as positive as were AZT, protease inhibitors, and ACE inhibitors for congestive heart failure. But many promising new treatments turn out to be no better than placebos, such as soluble CD4, dextran, prophylactic lidocaine, and CPR using a plunger device. And unfortunately, some treatments turn out to actually harm those who take them in RCTs, as did suramin and hypothermia in AIDS, 3 arrhythmia suppression drugs, and the inotropic drug milrinone for severe congestive heart failure. The most dangerous was the phase 2 trial of FIAU for chronic active hepatitis that, as you remember, killed 5 out of 15, or 33% of participants. This list reminds us that while trying to recruit minority people, indeed all people, to participate in RCTs, we should make clear to participants and to ourselves that we do not know and cannot predict the outcome. If we did know and could predict, we would not need to do the research. Next overhead. Well, the answer to the question of possible contradiction between the inclusion of minorities and the principle of justice is that it depends on how female and minority people are included. I will describe protocols reviewed by the National Indian Health Service IRB that I chair to illustrate what I mean. Consider 3 research protocols that we review. One researched the basic pathophysiology and pathoanatomy of diabetic kidney disease by doing kidney biopsies on American Indian adults with diabetes before they had any clinical evidence of kidney disease. That is, research was the only justification for the biopsy. The second was an RCT to prevent onset of non-insulin dependent diabetes among American Indian people diagnosed with impaired glucose tolerance, or IGT. The arms of the RCT included an investigational new drug, an approved anti-diabetes drug not approved for use in IGT, and non-drug interventions of intense diet and exercise. And the third was a multi-arm RCT comparing different antihypertensive and lipid-lowering agents to prevent cardiovascular disease. The following were steps or structures used to minimize vulnerability of the population in one or more of these 3 protocols. Both the researchers and IRBs consulted with the tribal communities, specifically with the tribal government and staff of the tribal health departments, to determine how to format the protocol to facilitate access, to be user-friendly, and to maximize cultural appeal. For instance, once a person consented to the kidney biopsy protocol, the first protocol I mentioned, the researchers relied on the outreach and care of the existing diabetes care staff. We should all be aware that there is a potential danger in this step. This step is ethically neutral and can be used to increase recruitment and retention of minority people in unethical research. And in fact, the reason the Tuskegee syphilis study lasted 40 years with only about 1% of subjects lost to follow-up, which is an amazing statistic, was its use of culturally relevant procedures such as employing an African-American nurse as main contact person, conducting it with the Tuskegee Institute, and paying for burial expenses. Next overhead. The tribal government approved all 3 research protocols. In fact, the Indian Health Service has a policy that it will only participate in research that has been formally approved by the tribal governments with jurisdiction. Furthermore, the tribal community participated in the planning and execution of the research. In this way, the research and community discussed and accommodated their concerns. For instance, 2 of the 4 tribal governments participating in the RCT to prevent type 2 diabetes decided to not include the experimental IND drug as one of the arms due to their discomfort with the drugs with which there was little experience. As another example, the membership of the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, called DSMBs, of the multi-arm RCT to prevent cardiovascular disease included 2 people from the tribal communities. While this may surprise some researchers, other non-scientists have been on DSMBs. For instance, the ethicist from the Kennedy Center at Georgetown, Leroy Walters, was a member of the DSMB that stopped the arrhythmia suppression RCT due to the increased mortality of the drugs mentioned in the previous overhead. In other words, DSMBs consider not just, quote, scientific and statistical facts, unquote, but also values related to those facts, just as IRBs consider both facts and values. And just as IRBs have multiple values represented by having several kinds of people, including non-scientists, so too we encourage DSMBs to include people from several different ethical and social value systems, such as tribal communities, to discuss the meaning of the scientific and statistical facts to the volunteers in the research and to their community. Next overhead. The consent process for the individual potential volunteer is also important. IHS IRBs pay particular attention to what is the knowledge needed to make an informed decision, which frequently is different than what the lawyers want to include. We rely on our non-scientist tribal members to help us with that process. We also want potential volunteers to be given plenty of time to consider consent, frequently at least overnight to permit discussion with a person's family for complex protocols. And then especially complex protocols, we have the research team check each individual's comprehension before then asking for consent. Next, go ahead. Finally, when we make mistakes, we should preserve the public's trust. Notice that I do not say if we make mistakes, because researchers and IRBs are human beings. We, and you notice I use the term that includes myself, must assume that we will make mistakes. While we should try to minimize mistakes, we should also prepare ourselves to deal with those mistakes that we will make. The evidence of the more recent research scandals involving minority people, and thank goodness they're not as bad as the scandals of the past, is that ignoring the mistakes make them worse. Rather, we should recognize our mistakes, admit them, actively correct them, and publicly set the situation right, and do public outreach in the communities affected. If you do not remember or not understand what I'm referring to, it was the measles vaccine trial in Los Angeles, run by CDC and Kaiser Permanente in primarily minority neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Let me step back, next overhead please. Let me step back to provide an overview of the IHS approach. The National Commission's Belmont report applied the three ethical principles of respect of persons, beneficence and non-maleficence, and justice to individuals as outlined in this overhead. Now, IHS tries to consider not just the individual potential volunteer in the research, however, but also that person's community. Many American Indian and Alaska Native people and communities feel vulnerable as communities. The Euro-American countries had expected the native peoples in North America to literally die out and disappear by the early 20th century. For instance, the number of native people steadily declined in the U.S. Census and counts by the Bureau of Indian Affairs through the 19th century, reaching a lowest point around 1900 to 1910. That low point was only 5% to 11% of the estimated native population in the same geography when Columbus arrived. Not surprisingly, having so recently survived what was thought to be their imminent demise as native peoples, many American Indian and Alaska Native individuals and communities have core values that their political, social, cultural, and educational survival as a distinct community in the midst of an overwhelmingly dominant society is of paramount importance. Next overhead. As shown in this overhead, we apply these same three ethical principles to tribal communities. Thus, researchers respect the Native communities by soliciting their fully informed consent of communities, at least to their tribal governments. It is also obligatory to minimize risk and maximize benefit to tribal communities. Note that the risk and benefit, those two terms, are defined not only by the scientists and professionals, but also by the communities themselves. For instance, CDC made a great achievement by discovering within only 3 weeks of being called that the cause of an epidemic of an acute, often fatal pulmonary disease first observed on the Navajo Reservation in May 1993 was a previously unrecognized hantavirus. The listing of the Navajo place names of the initial cases in CDC's first 2 scientific publications, however, in spite of the request from the Navajo Nation's Department of Health, harmed that community as that community defined harm. In reaction, the Navajo Nation permitted no research, none, to be conducted within its reservation for more than a year, and formed its own IRB to approve and disapprove all future research. Finally, the principle of justice requires that research be appropriate for the given tribal community. That is, that the research is a high priority for the community and is not proposed only because the population's health records are accessible through the Indian Health Service, or only to meet the initiative for the inclusion of minorities. Next overhead, please. In other words, IHS is concerned about the relationship between researcher and community, that the relationship be a respectful partnership and not exploitive. Relationship should be one of the last 4 stages, or numbers, in this continuum of researcher-community relationship, of who is in charge, from researchers ignoring the community, number 1, to the community does its own research with its own priorities, number 6. And again, I suggest that we should strive for the last 4 out of those 6. The modified application of the 3 principles of the Belmont Report to communities and the 6 stages of researcher-community relationship relevant outside the IHS to communities other than tribal. In particular, are they relevant to research in the military? I believe there are 3 relevances. First, these principles and approaches should govern international research done by the military or done by anyone else. Second, I recognize that minority communities other than American Indian and Alaska Native do not have legally recognized governments. But involving minority communities in a similar, albeit informal fashion, is likely both to observe the principle of justice by appropriate inclusion of minority people, including, as Karen pointed out, not just recruitment, but also retention, while ensuring that we do not return to the former overuse and exploitation of minority groups in research. In fact, it is now standard for research in AIDS and breast cancer to involve those affected communities, as we all know. Third, there are parallels to research in the command situation, such as the military, and I now want to discuss the latter relevance. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments recommended certain steps to improve this is a quote, the protection of the rights and interests of military personnel with respect to human subject research. The committee recommended 2 specific steps to maximize voluntariness. One was that unit COs and senior NCOs be excluded from sessions involving members of a unit to recruit for research. And second, an ombudsman be present at all such recruitment sessions to monitor voluntariness and adequacy and accuracy of the information presented. And as we've already heard, the military has incorporated those steps into their regulations. Now, Karen and I left plenty of time for discussion, both about what we presented, but also about this last topic. We would like to have in the next, I guess, an hour, all of us in this meeting come up with ideas additional to the 2 recommendations by the Human Radiation Committee to ensure voluntariness for research in the command situation. What are your suggestions, either derived from relevant parallels to inclusion of women and minorities while avoiding exploitation, or simply other suggestions? And perhaps another question, do you think that voluntariness is as big a problem as the Radiation Experiment Committee thought? Thank you.
Well, I think both of our speakers have brought forth a lot of issues that we could discuss today. Those of you who would like to just go to the microphones and ask questions, that's fine, or there will be people, if you'd rather, send in cards coming down to collect them. So whichever you'd like. We have any questions? Well, I'll begin by asking Karen. It was my understanding that in the VA studies that do, in fact, many clinical trials, that NIH has turned down some of them on the grounds that there weren't women involved in it, and that investigators have been encouraged to then go find a collaborative partner so that they can look at women for the same issues. What does the military do in situations like that when there are inadequate females, even though the process being looked at affects females as well as males, but in situations where there are not any or small numbers of women? What do you think about that?
Well, they have to figure out a way to find them. So I don't know enough to know whether this is not allowed. I mean, depending on the context of the research, are they able to use the pool of dependents? I mean, in terms of active duty men and their dependents, which might be women, that would expand their pool. I think depending on my understanding is depending on whether it was healthy subjects, which you can recruit outside the military, versus unhealthy subjects, which you might not be able to, but you could still use dependents in that context. Mm-hmm. That would be a way to expand your pool. But if you want to do a study and it is generalizable to women, you can't do it if it excludes them. I mean, that's unethical because it's bad science. It's a waste of resources. So in that context, I think we have to be more creative. And if there continues to be a problem about it, we have to revisit what our recruitment and retention strategies have been.
Yes, please. Yeah, there's one over here. You can.
Thank you.
Our IRB reviewed a protocol that was a pharmacokinetics protocol where arguments were posed that the female subjects would change the form of data because of body fat composition differences. And it became clear as this argument was being posed that the investigator was interested in getting a narrower standard deviation to the data and wasn't considering that the drug that he was testing was going to be used in both male and females in a battlefield type situation to protect them against a disease. Initially, we were unable to get this investigator to use females at all in the study. But subsequently, on review, related to the comment that you made when I raised my hand, this investigator was required to repeat the study in female subjects, so that there were two studies, one in male subjects and one study in female subjects, in order to continue to do the studies.
What happened? I mean, was there a difference?
Not a significant difference in the two groups.
Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on how the military might handle the situation? Not the, okay, yes, go ahead. Dr. Levine.
I have no comments that are specific to the military. So if anyone does, maybe they ought to do that before I shift the subject slightly. Apparently no one does. I want to point out that the rules that require inclusion of women and inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities are often present confusing expectations to the IRBs. The problem is that there are two separate arguments supporting the inclusion of these people, and they're both grounded in considerations of justice. The first argument goes, well, it's not fair to exclude women from clinical trials because they're entitled to seek access to the benefits of participation in the clinical trial. The second argument also says that's not fair. It's not fair to exclude women from clinical trials because women as a class of people are entitled to the benefits of the knowledge that comes from clinical trials so that new drugs, for example, can be demonstrated safe and effective for women and that there can be proper understandings of how to use the drugs in women. The man who was at this microphone last gave us an excellent example of how the pharmacokinetics, though conveniently consistent when studied in men, may be quite a bit different in women, and you have to know that while you're considering what doses to use in women. Now, in order to be responsive to the first argument about fairness to the individual women to get the benefits of participation, all you need is an open door policy. Any woman that wants to come in and participate in the trial will be welcomed in. On the other hand, or what happens as a consequence of the open door policy is that you may get a lot of data that you're not ever clear as to whether they're especially relevant to men or women, and gender-linked differences are likely to be swallowed up in the variation. The other argument that women are entitled to the benefits of new knowledge calls for a vastly different approach to doing a clinical trial. You must then enlarge the number of subjects that are studied and stratify by gender. And if you want to be attentive to all the rules at once, you enlarge it so that you can stratify by race and that you can stratify by ethnic subgroup. And that way you come out with data that are especially relevant to each of these groups. You also come out with a rather expensive clinical trial. NIH has put us on notice that the cost is no object, that whatever it costs, you've got to do this. Thank you.
Do you have any answer? The first question from the card is there an official stand as to the risk taken by an unborn child during drug trials, for example, in oncological chemotherapy, or things like that?
Actually, on our Institute of Medicine committee, we had an oncologist who treats pregnant women and treats people with cancer, but included in people that get cancer are pregnant women. And her view, at least, was that they had significant limitations on their ability to know what to do with pregnant women because they didn't have any data. So at least in phase 3 trials, and well, even before phase 3s, it was their protocol was to include pregnant women with cancer when there was not an alternative in the treatment trials, quote, treatment trials. That basically the view was that if the mother were dead, there wasn't going to be a child, and that the risks to the fetus had to be balanced against the benefits to both the child and the pregnant woman in having a chance at having some sort of benefit from research. I don't know if that responds to it or for the person that put the question in, but basically that would certainly fit within the category of there being some medical benefit.
Yes.
Dr. Bolger, I just wanted to make a comment, if I may, and it's primarily to the audience, and that is that the question of reviewing women's participation in biomedical research in the Department of Defense, that the Department is currently looking at this to determine what the best way is to ensure that the Department complies. And I'm sure that in the next a couple of months that there will be direction out to the field, either during various reviews at the lower levels on up, that they're going to be looking at various research protocols and various segments or types of research that's done to see what the participation of women in these research projects are. And this is something that will be followed up on. I'm sure that if Dr. Anna Johnson-Winiger were here, she could probably, because it's DDR&E that is addressing this, but she's not here, and in her absence, I want to at least mention that this is something that people can look forward to in the future.
While you're at the microphone, you might answer one of these questions, or just in general. This question relates to the special ethical and legal precedents that are intended to protect minor children of military personnel from experimental interventions, unless they directly benefit. Can you just comment on the special military rules in this regard?
Well, there is Title 980, which indicates basically that you're not allowed, I think each service has its own means of interpreting 980, but basically it says there must be a benefit before children are utilized in biomedical research in the Department of Defense.
A direct benefit to those children.
Yes. I think that's part of one of the reasons why there was a question at the last panel.
Because if it's a research project that you don't know if it's a benefit, therefore, if it's a research project, they can't be home.
Please repeat the question. And we can't hear you up here.
Come on down.
Go to the microphone.
Actually, this is a very important issue that's brought up quite frequently in the military context.
This is one of the grand catch-22s of our regulation, that in order for the dependent children of military personnel to be participants in some of the oncology protocols that either have developed reputations for being therapeutic and leading edge and saving lives, there must be proof that there's a benefit. Well, the protocols will not attest to the benefit, therefore military dependents can't be participants in the oncology protocols within the military system. And that's a catch-22. They need to be able to participate if they want to or not.
How
More
I'll give,
comments?
a quick reply to that while we're waiting for a meet. I don't review each one of the oncology protocols. So without looking at each protocol, it's difficult for me to say that there's never been an oncology protocol that has a benefit. I mean, I understand your perspective that if it's research, by the very nature of the word, there's no benefit. I tend to think that certainly, you know, in certain phase 1 trials or phase 2 trials where you're trying to answer a question, you know, it may be very difficult to see where you're going in research. But certainly in class 3 trials where you've already proven safety and you've proven efficacy and in a possibility where you have oncology protocols where there is no effective treatment out there, you know, I think this is open for some discussion, and that's why I think we need to be here, and we need to discuss some of these issues. So I think that's why you have IRBs, and that's why IRBs are local, and that's why you have to have people that have an opportunity to review this, and when there's questions, you have to be able to bring in experts who can discuss it and to have some consultations, and that's why we have the system that we have it. I don't know that it's a blank DOD policy that you can never have a protocol involving children.
Okay, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, actually, I have two things, a question, but also to respond. There is no prescription against participation of children in pediatric oncology trials, for example, where there is a reasonable probability that they will benefit from the treatment, period. The real issue has to do with placebo control arms and non-treatment arms. By definition, these are normal kids who cannot participate, who can't benefit because there's nothing wrong with them. That's where we have a real problem. We get these protocols from Pediatric Oncology Group or NCI, which involve evaluation of a non-cancer sibling or an age-matched control group. Presumably, the participation is minimal risk or practically no risk. It's a blood specimen for karyotyping, or it's something that we would all agree probably doesn't entail a great deal of risk to the subject. But nonetheless, Title 10 USC 980 precludes their participation because as kids without disease, they cannot benefit by definition.
Well, and what's really interesting is maybe we should discuss for a minute, does that make sense? Because it raises something that came up in the earlier session about our worry about healthy children that don't have health care, and whether or not they have an incentive to be in minimal risk research, and whether or not your paradigm is just different here. I mean, let's hear the justification of why we might want to include them, except for the goodness of science and, I mean, all those other reasons. But otherwise, it raises some interesting parallels, I think.
As has been pointed out, in the military system, the only people who we can see for any reason are beneficiaries of care. So there isn't a coercive element in the provision of care for these kids, for us anyway.
Let me point out that what you're talking about is quite consistent with the general regulations for research involving children. There's no requirement of benefit for the individual child. However, if you want to go beyond minimal risk, you have to limit it to a minor increase above minimal risk, and also you must demonstrate that the procedure that presents the risk will be commensurate with what those what those children will experience given their circumstances. That's where you get into the problem about doing normal controls, because there are no procedures that are commensurate with the experience of a normal child. So you can never get you can never do studies to establish, for example, normal control or normal ranges of various laboratory tests and so on. I think what I really came here to talk about this time, though, was if there is a directive precluding the involvement of all children in the military, unless there's direct benefit for the individual child, then what you've accomplished is turning the clock back to 1974. This is exactly what created the injustice that came to be known as the therapeutic orphan phenomenon. Nobody was willing to do any research on children, and therefore there were no drugs proved safe and effective for use in children between 1962 and the or late 1970s. So that's a real problem, and someone ought to do something about it.
Wait, but in all fairness, Bob, I think that the point that's being raised here is, in the military, do they have a justification for having that rule differently than everyone else that after 1974 opened it up a little bit? I mean, is there I mean, that's what I would like to hear your comment on that. Should they have a different rule than for everybody else?
There could be a justification for a different rule within the military, and that is the recognition since the late 1970s that vulnerable populations include persons other than those who merely can't give informed consent. The 1978-81 regulations seem to limit their definition of vulnerable to those who couldn't consent. Now that we have international documents that recognize persons who are in subordinate positions in a hierarchical social structure are vulnerable, and by that they mean, among other people, people in the military service, that they might be subject to getting direct orders from an officer-investigator, it might be valid to develop special rules for the dependents of military personnel. But I think that would be a simplistic interpretation, and I can see no other justification for this.
Did you?
I just would like to point out that this is a matter of law. It is not military policy. It's imposed by Congress, Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Part 980.
But laws are made by humans, and if no humans left,
Okay, let's go back to some of the questions that have been sent up. One of them goes, let me read it first and then maybe try to reinterpret it. In keeping with the IHS policy of involving tribal government in protocol planning, should IRBs not be encouraged to have minority female representation when reviewing protocols? In other words, talk about the IHS tribal policy, and does it have women and other minorities on it and so on?
Yes, those 2 points are not mutually exclusive. And you want, Indian Health Service wants both, and I think tribal communities want both. We require our non-scientists to be members of tribal communities. Many of our researchers and scientists that are on the IRB are also American Indian or Alaska Native, but specifically we require the non-scientists to be. And we're more strict about what we can do or not do with their presence. The point is that there are multiple values and concerns that are out there, and that I, as an individual, even though I've been in the Indian Health Service a long time, and even though I'm married to an Alaska Native, and I don't necessarily understand. And so you want people who have more knowledge. You want to expand the knowledge pool in the IRBs, and you want to maintain the trust of the communities. In the Indian health setting, that includes tribal approval. As we've already heard with AIDS, or know with AIDS and breast cancer, it means their participation in the planning, and I think that can and has happened in other minority communities without tribal governments, their involvement as communities in helping to plan the research, to make it, first of all, simply, again, more user-friendly, greater access, but also to have the research be more practical and meet their concerns. It becomes a mutual trust and a reciprocal relationship of mutual benefit, rather than one person in charge and the other one simply saying, yeah, I as an individual participator, or I
I'd like to clarify that. That was my question, and I'd like to clarify it a little bit more. What I was suggesting was that I think it's well done the way tribal governments are incorporated into the IRBs. I'd like to suggest that we should probably extend that to other non-Indian Health Service IRBs to get better incorporation of minorities and women, especially minorities of communities where of the types of protocols that are being suggested, because we can't assume that because we have professionals on the IRB that they will necessarily know the needs, concerns, and culturally significant issues of the communities in which they want to do those protocols. So I probably didn't phrase that
And that
properly.
was actually one of the recommendations from the workshop in 1996, that there needed to be more diversity on the IRB
Right.
itself.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. And I think the breast cancer is an area where they're doing that too, and nicely as well. Yes.
Excuse me, that begs one more question, I think, relative to the same issue. What predetermines which body will speak or not speak for the individual within the community? And what happens if the rights of the individual conflict with the rights of the tribe in this case, or any other body that's asked to speak for the community?
Do you want to respond?
Sure. There are two. I'll take the second one and then remember your first one. I am not aware of specific instances where the rights of the individual have conflicted. The community does not require the individual to participate in research. In other words, you still have to have the consent of the individual. Now, the one possible area is where the community says, no, we will not permit the research on this reservation. Now, that does not exclude the research. Research can be done off the reservation, and an individual member, citizen of the tribe can participate in the research. In other words, the jurisdiction of the tribal government is a geographical jurisdiction, does not prohibit, they cannot prohibit activities of their members off the reservation. What was your first question? Sorry?
What determines which body
Yes.
will speak for that individual?
That's always a problem that seemed to be, by the way, much more of a problem for the outsiders than for the insiders. I mean, first of all, with tribal governments, tribal government is a tribal government. And by the way, let me make it clear, we're not saying that the tribal governments are any better than the U.S. Congress. And so I'm serious about this. A lot of researchers say, you know, those darn tribal governments, they're just no good. And I say, well, you know, actually, I look at them, I think they're probably better than U.S. Congress most of the time, at least around research. You know, it is Jesse Helms, after all, who, if you want to talk about prohibiting research, who prohibited the studies on adolescent sexuality related to HIV prevention. So we have our own problems about what our governments do and don't do. I think it's a bigger, within Indian communities, on the other hand, it is like our government. It does not necessarily, these communities are not homogeneous. There's variation within them, as in our own society. So that if a researcher wants to get optimal information and consultation with the communities, he or she should not just consult with the tribal government, but also with the health department and people in the community and so on, which is, by the way, the same in our country. It's a bigger problem with communities where there is not an identified and legal representative voice. And when we're saying that we think this should occur in a lot of minority communities, there you have to simply try to listen to people who are seen by the community members themselves as spokesmen and leaders, and also have lots of open meetings, if possible, for anyone else to talk. It sounds like you have another.
Well, you know, Jesse Helms is a member of the Senate and of a government that is recognized, you know, worldwide. And you said yourself the native cultures don't have a nationally recognized or internationally recognized government. But
No, I didn't say that.
The reason why I bring this issue, the reason why I bring this issue forward is that if you take this by extension to include other groups, no matter how you break it down, and you give them the authority as your group does to say no, it will not take place in our property or our lands, then aren't you then politicizing this, and aren't you then actually impairing the rights of the individual within those groups?
Let me make a clarification. The tribal governments are legally recognized. It's in the other communities that I was talking about. But the tribal governments are recognized by the U.S. government as having jurisdiction, and they can exclude researchers from their jurisdiction legally. The question is about, there are two questions. Is that a good policy to follow? And here reasonable people can disagree. I think it's a good policy for two reasons. One is if we didn't allow it, then there are other implications about that legal status of tribal governments that would have to be changed. In other words, this is simply part of a larger situation of the status of tribal governments. On a more humane basis, as I said before, there are values that American Indian and Alaska people as individuals, many of them have, not all of them, but many of them have, and that many communities have, about the survival of the communities as communities. It's something that most of us, and I'll include myself in this, cannot appreciate because we have not, in the lifetime of our elders, of our parents, gone through what appeared to be an imminent demise of us as a people. In other communities, non-Indian communities, it is not so much a veto as it is a partnership. And as a matter of fact, even in Indian communities, the point is that what we want to have is where people are sitting down at the same table and working as partners rather than a veto of one group over the other. And I have seen that by and large, with very few exceptions, that is achievable on both parts. And in that case, the research is much more relevant to the communities than it would be otherwise.
Let me go ahead because there's some really very good questions here. How do we ensure adequate assessments of variance among different racial groups given current biases?
Well, you do the best you can. I mean, what's the alternative? Not doing it at all? I actually want to pick up on that question without, I didn't mean to be flippant about it, but to raise what I actually see as a real challenge that I think was partly in your question, and which is almost a paradox. And that is, as we promote and encourage there being more analysis of subgroup populations in research and doing valid analysis, we run the risk of stigma. That it's ironic and it's almost a paradox, is that the better we are at dividing people into categories based on the scientific justification that we can do better risk assessment and to treat them better, on the other hand, we run the risk of pointing them out at higher risk, stigmatizing them, having implications for discrimination. And I really struggle with this. I don't know the answer to it. So I think the best we can do, as any good lawyer and ethicist does, is, we sort of focus on the process. So one way to deal with this really paradox in some ways is to have this dialogue with the community that we need to be behind and recognize these risks and still make an assessment that the relative benefits of getting the knowledge outweigh the risks, the social risks of what's going to be the harm. And this is going to be particularly more of a challenge for us as we do more genetic studies. Because genetics, in some ways, the way it's been done by its very definition has been to do it by ethnic groups, by family studies. And I think this is just something on the radar screen, if it's not already on your radar screen, that you really need to be very sensitive about. Just one very quick example of this, and that has to do with the Ashkenazi Jewish studies that were just done on BRCA1 and 2 genetic mutations for breast cancer. There was an IRB that reviewed the taking of Tay-Sachs samples, blood samples that were taken in the 1970s and 1980s and early 1990s, and they were stored. And their names were taken off, so they were anonymized, so to speak. And those were the samples that were originally used to make this first hunch that the Ashkenazi Jewish community might have a higher percentage of this mutation. And then now there have been some follow-up studies that have raised some questions about penetrance and percentages. But when the IRB initially looked at it rather quickly, they said, well, there are no names on it, so there can't be any worries about confidentiality and privacy. But there was a community concern. I mean, it certainly had group implications for that group, and the people that originally gave the Tay-Sachs samples didn't know and couldn't have known that they may have contributed to the progress of research on breast cancer and this genetic mutation. But I think it raises something that Bill has raised about, I mean, they are a community that might have some interest both at a group level and at an individual level in their identification. But not to do it, I mean, I can think of another study while I was at NIH involving African American women and some higher rates of certain forms of diabetes. I mean, what we worry about is, okay, how do we take that information and make it a good for individuals without making it a harm in the context of the society we live in? Is that less of a risk in the protection of the military? Again, I come back to, I don't know, I have this sense that, well, at least you've got protection for your health care. I don't know if these levels of stigma are different within the military or not. I mean, that's sort of maybe a controversial issue. But certainly people worried about this in genetics. One, they worry about behavioral genetics, stigmatizing certain groups that are at higher risk for violence, for alcoholism. I mean, all those sorts of things. If you look just at an individual model, that may not capture all those sorts of risks. But the better we are at subgroup analysis, some of those questions get heightened. So it all comes back to, I think, the very first question that's at the core of ethics. I mean, is this a study worth doing? Are we asking a question that can be answered that we think will be of benefit to our society? And I think everything else has to flow from that core concern.
Let me just add, again, with subgroups, it's also asked the question, not just benefit to the society, but benefit to the subgroup that's being studied. And again, although usually the idea is that there may be an opposition about it, I've been impressed that when people sit down at the same table, things can be accommodated, concerns can be accommodated, so both the general society wins, is benefited, as well as the group, both not harmed, but also benefited.
Is there one more quick question up at the microphone?
I'm not sure how quick it is. If it's not quick enough, we can skip it. You brought up earlier, Ms. Rothenberg, the issue of removing paternal consent for pregnant women, and it brings up the larger issue of informed consent for women and certain requirements that may or may not exist for different groups. For instance, pregnancy tests, which are sometimes required on informed consents. And how does that fit in with a woman's right to choose whether she wants to be involved or not, and so on and so forth?
Well, I don't see a problem with offering a pregnancy test because requiring it. Well, I mean, Bill, you may want to respond to this too. I mean, the question is, if she says I'm not pregnant and she says I'm not in a situation to be pregnant, and she may even not have the ability to get pregnant, what is the benefit of requiring the test? The perception of the individual is that they don't trust me, that basically they're going to second guess me, or I don't know my own self. And of course, there's whether or not there's some sort of equivalent on asking at least the man who has risks associated with their reproduction as well, as to whether or not they're planning on participating in something that can get somebody pregnant. I mean, we have, I think, done a big disservice to men in not really recognizing and studying what the implications of male reproductive risk may be in the context of research as well. But I'm going to pass. Bill has actually been more vocal about this issue than I am, so I'm going to let him say something finally.
In our IRB, we are pretty adamant that the usual, what used to be required, things like a required pregnancy test, and then you had to have only a very limited number of forms of contraception, or else you couldn't be in the trial, that's been expanded to include not having sex or not having sex with a male, and other forms of protection is acceptable. And the risks to the women we require, obviously, as Karen pointed out, are set in the consent form. But we don't require that they go through a hoop that is artificial. If they say they're doing what's effective, then we accept that.
I was just going to say, I think, again, I would look at the context of the study. I mean, it's not something that routinely has to always be in there. I mean, there could be studies, I've seen informed consent forms when that's in there when the woman doesn't have any ovaries. I mean, there's no way she's getting pregnant, and it's still in the study. That's sloppy. That's just sloppy, and that should be corrected. I mean, so first of all, you have to ask, well, why isn't this in here? Is it relevant at all? And then, I don't know about the privacy and confidentiality implications of somebody in the military saying, well, I don't need to have a pregnancy test, I'm a lesbian. I mean, what would be the implications of that? I don't know if somebody...
That's why we use a phrase...
confidential?
That's why we use the phrase...
They get kicked out.
Come down here. What we do is we require that... They say they're not having sex with a male. That's all we're interested in that category.
Which they're not supposed to be doing.
Since we're about to end, Ruth, is that correct?
Yeah.
I was expecting that there's going to be a half-hour discussion about this research in the command situation, voluntariness in the command situation. Obviously, it didn't happen. So I had made and didn't hand out ahead of time a bunch of things that went beyond what the Radiation Committee, those two things that they proposed, partly based on and primarily based on my experience in minority communities. And you'll get them as you leave. I just make a point that I was also in the military for 4 years back in Nam and all that kind of stuff. And my perception is that most of us in the military really, it's not a big problem about being coerced into research, but there are some ways, there are some subgroups that were. And again, this is almost 30 years ago, I guess? Yeah, almost 30 years ago, so things may have changed. Maybe it is a problem. But I in particular thought that people going through basic training and early training probably have difficulty in figuring out that they are free to say no. So that's probably a group that one should be very careful about in trying to recruit and research. And then secondly, there are other ways of recruiting besides a unit meeting. So, you know, there's the REC program, there's the BX, there's the religious services, where you don't have the institutional pressure of the unit and people are there in another capacity, the hospital patients. Those are two things that I think would be much more relevant to consider about assuring voluntariness in the military. Then finally, as already been said, actually in another context, both NASA and CIA are having to deal with the same thing. Might be worthwhile, if this is a problem with the military, to meet with them.
Okay, let me quickly remind you that the only way we're going to get all of you fed and back here in 45 minutes is we have a preset lunch for everybody that has a name tag. Please enjoy it and be back in 45 minutes. Let's thank our speakers.